Yaakov's ladder, past and future. Today we are looking at Parashah 7, which refers to Yaakov going out from the family base, having received his father's blessing. But before we delve into that 20-year-long journey, we need to step back into chapter 27 and consider how Yitzchak was tricked into giving the blessing to Yaakov instead of his firstborn, Esav. Chapter 27 begins with Yitzchak deciding to pass on the firstborn blessing because he feared that he was nearing the end of his life. However, Scripture shows that he actually lived on for another 303 years. Yitzchak ordered Esav to hunt, kill, and prepare a tasty meal so that he could enjoy that while giving his blessing. However, Rivkah, his wife, overheard the conversation and realized that she had to do something to stop the birthright being given to Esav. She must have been well aware that years earlier Esav had sold his birthright to Yaakov in exchange for a bowl of stew. However, as a woman, she could not intervene directly in the passing of the mantle of responsibility to Esav, the firstborn. So she quickly prepared a meal for Yitzchak that he liked, dressed Yaakov in goat's hair to make him appear and smell like his brother. Having done all the preparations, Yaakov said to his mother, "Suppose my father touches me. He will know that I am trying to trick him, and it'll bring a curse upon me, not a blessing." She sent Yaakov into the presence of Yitzchak, having said, "Let any curse come upon me." Unaware of what had transpired, Yitzchak gave his blessing to Yaakov, all the while believing that the son standing before him was Esav. However, as the encounter progressed, Yitzchak began to suspect that he had been tricked by saying, "Come here close to me so that I can touch you, my son, and know that whether you are in fact my son Esav or not." Yaakov approached Yitzchak, his father, who touched him and said, "The voice is that of Yaakov, but the hand is that of Esav." Yitzchak asked, "Are you really my son Esav?" Yaakov replied, "I am." Now his response was significant because those same words were used by Yeshua on many occasions when confronted with the question about his messiahship. In such situations, Yeshua replied with just those two simple words, "I am." The words speak volumes. They defined who he really was, just as he said to Moshe at the burning bush in Shemot, Exodus chapter 3, "Ayeh asher ayeh, I am will be what I am will be." So what we are seeing here with Yaakov is a prophetic foundation being laid. However, at face value it appears to be a barefaced lie, because his statement was a direct answer to Yitzchak's question, "Are you really my son Esav?" That is one of the many complex problems that we encounter in Scripture, because the real challenge was being made on a much higher plane. Having earlier sold his birthright, Esav was no longer entitled to receive the blessing. Yet Yitzchak would have known also what had happened, and he favored his son. So Yitzchak knowingly was giving his blessing to the wrong son. However, El Shaddai was well aware of all that had transpired, and he knew that it was the adversary trying to steal and steer the family birthright away from the one who had been selected by El Shaddai himself. Yaakov was to be the rightful recipient, and everyone knew that that was true. If we look back to the time of Rivkah, when she pleaded with El Shaddai to terminate her pregnancy, his response was in 24 verse 23, "There are two nations in your womb. From birth They will be two rival peoples. One of those peoples will be stronger than the other, and the older will serve the younger. The key words were, the older will serve the younger. We see from those words that even before the twins were born, El Shaddai knew whom he wanted to be the one to carry on the mantle of responsibility for the development of what would be later become the chosen nation of Israel. It was Yaakov who later received the name Israel, not Esav. Hence, at the time of the birthright blessing, the adversary was using devious tactics to ensure that the wrong son would be blessed. Yitzchak blessed the one he thought was Esav by saying, "May God give you the dew from heaven, riches of the earth, grain and wine in abundance. May people serve you, and all nations bow down before you. May you be Lord over your kinsmen. Let your mother's descendants bow down to you. Cursed be everyone who curses you, and blessed be everyone who blesses you." Those are powerful words that Yitzchak passed on to Yaakov, and those same words are today causing a backlash against Israel, because the adversary knows all the nations will one day be subject to Yaakov, whose name is now, of course, Israel. Hence, the current Middle Eastern crisis is being spurred on by the adversary before he is chained for 1,000 years during the reign of Yeshua. El Shaddai said through Yitzchak in his concluding remarks, "Cursed be everyone who curses you, and blessed be everyone who blesses you." Here we are seeing how the nations of the world are soon to get their just reward. Those which presently curse Israel will be crushed and stripped of their power forever. By contrast, those nations that are currently blessing Israel will be spared the ultimate destruction, just as the prophet Daniel was told in chapter 7 verse 12. As for the other animals, their rulership will be taken away, but their lives will be prolonged for a time and a season. Only the nations that are now blessing Israel will be acknowledged during that restorative reign of Yeshua, albeit without the ability to rule. It is interesting that Yitzchak said also, "Let your mother's descendants bow down to you." Through those words it appears that Yitzchak thought that he was actually blessing Esav, meaning, of course, that the descendants of Yaakov would actually bow down to the descendants of Esav. But the reality was the opposite. The people of Edom, or Esav, would bow down to the one chosen descendant of Yaakov, who of course is none other than Yeshua. So upon discovering that Yitzchak had blessed Yaakov, Esav became extremely angry toward his brother, saying in verse 41, "The time for mourning my father will soon come, and then I will kill my brother Yaakov." What Esav did not realize was that even though his father was almost totally blind, he would live for yet another 103 years. Meanwhile, Rivkah heard what Esav had said and realized the depth of the hatred Esav harbored towards his brother. She reasoned that if she did not act, she may well become a widow with two warring sons that may kill each other. Then she would be left totally without family to support her in her old age. So Rivkah again plotted as to how she could diffuse the hatred between her sons. She suggested that Yaakov escape the scene and stay with her brother Lavan for a short time. Then, hopefully, Esav's anger would abate enough that they could reconcile. She planned that once Esav calmed down, she would send word to Yaakov and he would return home. But she did not know that Yitzchak would outlive her by another 5 years, and that by sending Yaakov away, she would not see him for at least another 20 years, if ever. Scripture does not mention whether Rivkah and Yaakov met again upon his return, but the book of Jubilees suggests that she was still alive when he did return. Hence, in chapter 27, it closes by showing that her reason for sending Yaakov away to Lavan had a double purpose. Not only did she want to defuse the situation between her sons, but she also wanted to ensure that Yaakov found a wife from his own family of origin. The clue to her second reason for dispatching her beloved son appears in verse 46, where Rivkah said to Yitzchak, "I am sick to death of Hittite women. If Yaakov marries one of the Hittite women, like those who live here, my life will not be worth living." Responding to Rivkah, in chapter 28, verses 1 to 4, Yitzchak called Yaakov after blessing him, charging him with the words, "You are not to choose a wife from the Hittite women. Go to the home of Bethuel, your mother's father, and choose a wife from the daughters of Lavan, your mother's brother. May El Shaddai bless you, make you fruitful and increase your descendants until they become a whole assembly of peoples. And may he give you the blessing which he gave to Abraham, you and your descendants with you, so that you will possess the land through which you travel, the land God gave to Abraham." So the promise El Shaddai had made to Abraham and Yitzchak was now being passed on to that third generation. The promise was all about the territory that Yaakov would travel through on his way to Lavan. That same territory is Eretz Isra'el, over which the dispute still rages even today. Then in the first part of chapter 28, Esav reflects on how he had greatly displeased his parents by taking wives from among the Hittite people, whom Yahweh would later remove from the land of promise. Esav realized the level of his error in marrying into those despicable people and took for himself daughter of Ishmael, Abraham's firstborn son. So the family loop was closed. The descendants of Esav today are interwoven with the descendants of Ishmael, which has resulted in a strong tribal alliance between Edom and many Arab people groups who collectively despise Israel, their close relative. So that brings us to today's parashah, where we start in chapter 28, verse 10. Yaakov finally leaves the family home in Beersheba and heads northward on his journey to Haran. Then, in verse 11, we're told that he came to a certain place and stayed the night there because the sun had set. He took a stone from the place, put it under his head, and lay down there to sleep. That certain place, where it was, is not stated, but in chapter 28, verse 9, it does say, he named the place Beit El, that is, house of God. But the town at that stage was originally known as Luz. That suggests that the location was actually Beit El, where his grandfather had built an altar to El Shaddai. However, rabbinical sages have suggested that it was actually Mount Moriah, based on the words of Bereshit 22 verse 4, where it says, "On the third day, Abraham raised his eyes and saw the place in a distance," which relates to Abraham presenting Yitzchak as a burnt offering. We are told that that event did actually occur on Mount Moriah, but Luz, which was renamed Beit El, appears to be the more likely location, according to the words of chapter 28, verse 9. Regardless of where the place was, Yaakov slept overnight and had the well-known dream about the ladder that rested on the ground with its top extending into heaven. He also saw the angels of El Shaddai ascending and descending. Upon awakening, he realized that what had occurred. and erected a stone pillow as a marker and called the place Beit El. So why was the location and that event so significant? It was because of what El Shaddai had said to Yaakov in the dream. During the course of the dream, El Shaddai had stood next to Yaakov and repeated the promises that he had earlier made to Abraham, Yaakov's grandfather. The words in verse 14 were, "Your descendants will be as numerous as the grains of dust on the earth, and you will expand to the west, to the east, to the north, and to the south. By you all the descendants and all the families of the earth will be blessed." That was the same eternal promise that El Shaddai had made to all three patriarchs. That same promise is still being used by the adversary as an excuse to bring the wrath of many nations down upon Israel at this point in time. What is happening to Israel at this moment is a prelude of the wrath that will be meted out upon the nations in the 21st century world. However, the wrath upon those nations will be from Yeshua, not from the adversary. Now, having confirmed the promise, El Shaddai then turns his attention to Yaakov personally by saying in verse 15, "Look, I am with you, and I will guard you wherever you go, and I will bring you back into this land, because I won't leave you until I have done what I have promised to you." Those were deeply reassuring words that Yaakov needed to hear, because he was embarking on a journey that was going to take him well beyond the borders of Isra'el. He was heading into a territory that was completely unknown to him. He was going to meet his family of origin for the first time, a very daunting experience. The promise of El Shaddai made to Yaakov was that he would guard him wherever he went, and he would be sure to return to that same territory of Eretz Israel at the right time. El Shaddai then concluded with the reassuring words, "I won't leave you until I have done all that I have promised you." Were those words meant just for Yaakov, or were they to have an application over a much longer period? The answer is given many centuries later, when Yeshua spoke about the ladder reaching into heaven. In John chapter 1, verses 43 to 51, when Yeshua had returned to Beit Anya, he had returned from the 40 days in the wilderness, and he called his friend Philip to travel with him on the journey back to the Galilee. Philip in turn turned to Nathanael to join them. At that stage, Philip said to Nathanael, "We found the one Moshe wrote about in the Torah, also the prophets. It is Yeshua ben Yosef from Nazareth." Nathanael gave the typical response by saying, "Can anything good come from there?" That was the normal and typical response from people living in the Galilee at that stage, because they had much earlier been through a very troubling times when many common people fled from Judea into the Galilee as refugees to escape Archelaus, the tyrannical son of Herod the Great. Those refugees in the Galilee had grown up knowing from the Torah and the prophets that the promised Messiah would actually come from Bethlehem, not from the Galilee. So how could Yeshua be the Messiah? But Nathanael, as he approached Yeshua, Yeshua said, "Here, a true son of Israel, nothing false in him." Nathanael said to him, "How do you know me?" Yeshua answered, "Before Philip called you, when you were under the fig tree, I saw you." That was a very strange exchange for what was the first time encounter between the two. So Nathanael was so overwhelmed, he responded by saying, "Rabbi, you are the Son of God. You are the King of Israel." At that stage, Yeshua responded by saying, "You will see greater things than that." Then he said, "Indeed, yes, I tell you, that you will see heaven open and the angels of God going up and coming down on the Son of Man." And those words from Yeshua are a direct referral back to what was said to Yaakov during his dream. Only this time, Yeshua is looking forward to the time when he will be reigning from heaven. Yeshua did not qualify what he meant with those words, but because it was not the time to reveal the reality of what lay ahead and what would be the climax of his earthly ministry. Only now, nearly 2,000 years later, we can look back with the aid of the Ruach HaKodesh and see that Yeshua was actually speaking about how the new Jerusalem will come back into orbit close to the earth during his 1,000-year reign. He will also have the called Kohanim to be with him, and they will just ascend and descend between the new Jerusalem and the earthly third temple that is defined in the latter chapters of Ezekiel. The Kohanim will minister in that temple, and following their service will return to their heavenly home in New Yerushalayim, as defined in the book of Revelation. Here we are seeing a very strong and important link between what Yaakov was shown in his dream and what will happen in the Olam Haba, or the age to come. It was no accident that Yaakov was given the blessing by his father Yitzchak. It was no accident Nathanael, who became one of Yeshua's 12 emissaries, was told what will happen in the future. One final point that we need to consider on this matter is where the future ladder will be located. That brings us back to what I discussed earlier, where the rabbis have suggested Mount Moriah was the location where Yaakov laid down to sleep. Then it makes perfect sense that the ladder would be situated close to that third temple, which of course will be centered on what we now know as the Temple Mount in the midst of earthly Jerusalem. Did the rabbis know something that has possibly been lost in history? A very interesting question. But returning to Bereshit 28, verses 16 and 17, we find Yaakov woke up from his sleep and said, "Truly, El Shaddai is in this place, and I didn't know it." Then he became afraid and said, "This place is fearsome. This has to be the house of God. This is the gate to heaven." Was Yaakov given a sneak preview of life as it will be during Yeshua's reign of restoration? We don't know, but as he became fearful about what he had seen and heard, it may well be that Yeshua gave him a preview of the future. Chapter 28 concludes with the words in verse 18, Yaakov got up early in the morning, took the stone he had laid his head on, and made it a standing stone, poured olive oil on the top. Then he swore an oath that if God will be with me and guard me on the road that I am traveling, and give me bread to eat and clothes to wear, so that I may return to my father's house in peace, then El Shaddai will be my God, and the stone which I have set up as a standing stone will be God's house, and of everything you give me, I will faithfully return to you 1/10. Having earlier read chapters 29 through 31, we see that they cover the whole period Yaakov spent outside the borders of Eretz Israel. Therefore, as it's a well-known backstory that gives preparation to Yaakov's return to Eretz Israel, I will leave those chapters for consideration at some other time. Therefore, next Shabbat, we will pick up the narrative when Yaakov returns and crosses the Yabak River, when once again he enters Eretz Israel and completes the story with his whole family. Until then, Shabbat Shalom.